Coincidence. It's a word we toss around to explain the unexplainable, yet even scientists wrestle with its meaning. Consider the COVID pandemic and the introduction of mRNA vaccines. These vaccines, designed to prompt our cells to produce proteins that build immunity, were heralded as miracles. We were assured that the mRNA, a fleeting messenger, never enters the nucleus or alters our DNA. Still, millions accepted this without question, a stark demonstration of how fear and authoritative messaging can command obedience. As the vaccines rolled out, dissenting voices emerged. Doctors who advised caution were dismissed, their warnings silenced by a system that demanded conformity. In this climate of fear, critics began to question not only the vaccine's efficacy, but the very process by which they were enforced. Prominent figures like Bill Gates, whose investments and comments raised eyebrows, only deepened suspicions. He boasted of profits while admitting that the vaccines didn't prevent transmission or mutation, exposing a disturbing mix of commerce and public health. Reports surfaced of sudden deaths and unexplained health crises. In places like Alberta, Canada, official causes of death were shrouded in mystery. While the vaccines did temper the severity of the virus in some, the overall picture was muddled by shifting facts and hidden agendas. What began as a public health measure morphed into a tool of control, where dissent was equated with danger, and alternative views were branded as tin hat theories. History is no stranger to the dismissal of ideas that later prove revolutionary. The theory of Pangaea and continental drift, once ridiculed as a mere coincidence of similar rock formations across continents, eventually reshaped our understanding of Earth's history. The initial rejection of transformative ideas reminds us that truth can be buried under layers of institutional inertia and fear. The notion of meaningful coincidences, what Carl Jung later termed synchronicity, challenges our conventional cause and effect view of events. It suggests that the random might actually be orchestrated, part of an underlying order that defies our limited understanding. The universe, with its finely tuned constants and laws, seems too perfectly arranged to be mere chance. This perspective forces us to reconsider our place in a world where nothing is entirely random. Today, as laws emerge that criminalize criticism of medical practices and technological advancements, like France's statute threatening jail time for questioning mRNA vaccines, we are compelled to ask, who benefits from engineered consensus, a manipulation of truth, a reordering of society, where questioning becomes a dangerous act? Who benefits from engineered consensus, a manipulation of truth, a reordering of society, where questioning becomes a dangerous act? Questioning the coincidences around us, we are reminded that truth often travels a tortuous path, first mocked, then vehemently opposed, and finally accepted as self-evident. Perhaps what we dismiss as coincidence is, in fact, the universe revealing itself to us.
In 325 CE, Emperor Constantine decided that Christianity had become too unwieldy, a tangled web of mysteries and contradictions that undermined its usefulness as the state religion. One major problem was the doctrine of the Trinity. On paper, Christianity professed to be monotheistic, yet it claimed that one God eternally exists as three distinct persons: God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This apparent contradiction left many puzzled. How could God be both one and three? Before the Pauline conversion, Jesus was understood solely as God's Son. At some point, however, a dramatic shift occurred. Jesus was elevated to God himself. Constantine, intent on streamlining the faith to better manage his empire, dispatched 318 theologians to Nicaea. Their mission was to codify Christianity into a version that could be uniformly practiced. The gathering produced two significant decisions. First, they established a definition for the Trinity, even if it remained as perplexing as before, and they culled the surplus of Gospels, discarding 26 out of 30, to create a unified canon. Second, they debated the nature of Christ on earth. One camp argued that if Jesus were pure, untemptable God, he could not have sinned. The majority, however, insisted that Jesus was fully God and fully human. Though tempted like any man, he overcame sin because of his divine nature. This latter view became what we now call the Orthodox doctrine, while the alternative, often labeled Arianism, was deemed heresy. Today, many mainstream Christians unwittingly echo the Arian position. Controversy over these theological subtleties has persisted for centuries. When a Greek author penned The Last Temptation of Christ, revisiting the idea that Christ was tempted but ultimately transcended sin, the film adaptation sparked outrage. In the United States, viewers were scandalized, while in France, emotions ran so high that a theater was even set on fire. The backlash underscored a painful irony. The film's narrative was rooted in the Church's original Nicene teaching, a reminder of how far modern believers had drifted from early orthodoxy. I recall watching the 1970s comedy film Oh God at age 13. The movie portrayed God as an approachable, if unconventional figure, a character reminiscent of George Burns, who reached out to an everyday store clerk. Its blend of genuine faith, human uncertainty, and humor struck a chord with many, suggesting that a relatable God need not be blasphemous merely because he is humanized. Another core issue is the idea of biblical infallibility. Advocates claim the Bible is inspired because its authors were guided by God's hand, a claim often backed by citing 2 Timothy 3:16. All scripture was given by inspiration of God. But inspiration begs difficult questions. Was the Bible divinely inspired when it was written, or at the moment of translation? Which copy or version carries the true message? Hundreds of hand-copied manuscripts, each with subtle differences, attest to the Bible's complex transmission history. By BCE 130, Hebrew had largely fallen from everyday use, and after 100–0382 CE, the Gospels spread through the laborious work of scribes, leaving behind over 20,000 surviving copies. Eventually, as Greek gave way to Latin, the Bible was translated and retranslated over centuries. The King James Version, KJV, is among the most famous of these translations, but it was not the first English Bible. Pioneering work by William Tyndale in the early 1500s, despite earning him a heretical label and a fiery end in 1536 CE, laid the groundwork for later translations. King James' own version, published in 1611 CE, was more an adaptation than a completely new work, borrowing heavily from Tyndale and others. Over time, the KJV became the dominant Bible in colonial America, with a Philadelphia publisher once distributing over 1 million copies a year. Critics of the KJV-only movement, however, dispute the notion that any single translation can be divinely perfect. They argue, circular reasoning, claiming the KJV is perfect because it is the Word of God is a self-validating loop. Historical context. Early Christians faced manifold challenges, from manuscript burnings to heated ecclesiastical debates at councils that shaped the canon. Reducing this complex history to mere persecution oversimplifies matters. Selective scripture use. Verses like Ephesians 4:12–13, often cited to argue that God perfects his word over time, were meant to describe the spiritual growth of believers rather than the evolution of a text. Assume divine intervention. The idea that God directly oversaw the KJV's creation discounts the myriad historical, cultural, and political forces that have shaped the Bible. Despite these points, the KJV-only camp persists, insisting that the Textus Receptus, the Greek text underlying the KJV, is uniquely reliable, and that only the KJV can serve as an authoritative English translation. Mainstream scholars, though, note that the original texts were composed in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and that no translation can ever capture every nuance perfectly. Core Christian doctrines, they argue, survive intact across various translations. In summary, while the KJV remains a highly influential translation, its claim to divine perfection is a minority position. Its prominence was the result of a complex mix of political, cultural, and religious factors, a pattern that also characterized the formation of the biblical canon itself. Note that while the KJV is copyrighted in the UK by the British Crown, it is generally considered public domain elsewhere. Adding to the debate is a curious footnote in King James' own biography. History suggests that King James was involved in romantic relationships with men, most notably with George Villiers, who later became the Duke of Buckingham. This personal detail, while separate from the text's theological weight, complicates the notion of a divinely inspired translation emerging from a flawed human context. The story of the Bible's transmission does not end with the KJV. St. Jerome, for instance, translated the Bible into Latin from Greek between 383 and 44 CE, making critical corrections to the Old Testament using Hebrew texts. Yet even Jerome's work highlights a persistent mystery. The Bible as we know it recounts only a fraction of Jesus' life. Many details of his teachings remain hidden, perhaps locked away in the vaults of the Vatican, alongside complete versions of texts like the Gnostic Gospels. Discovered in 1945 near Nag Hammadi, the so-called Gnostic Gospels include alternative accounts, apocryphal acts, and apocalypses. Although not part of the official canon, they once held sway in some early Christian communities. Far from contradicting the New Testament outright, these texts often supplement its narratives by elaborating on secret teachings. In the Gospel of Mark, for example, Jesus speaks in parables to large crowds while revealing a secret mysterion of the kingdom of God to his disciples in private. This dual mode of communication, public parables paired with esoteric instruction, finds echoes in Paul's letters, where he refers to wisdom hidden by God for the mature. Before the Nicene Council and the rise of state-controlled religion, the Gnostic texts were cherished. Today, however, they are relegated to the margins as the official canon was solidified by governments and church authorities. Much of this lost literature was hidden away by early monks wary of Catholic persecution or simply dismissed as heretical. In this light, one might ask, who truly decides what is true? History suggests that government and institutional power have always played a decisive role in shaping and even suppressing religious texts. If the Bible were put on trial, its very authenticity might crumble under the weight of its convoluted chain of custody. The interplay of theology, politics, and human fallibility is written into every page, from Constantine's council at Nicaea to the clandestine preservation of the Gnostic Gospels.
Humans share a common ground through our senses. We all see a blue sky, recognize the aroma of fried bacon or coffee, and hear a dog's bark. These basic sensory experiences form a biological language that transcends explanation and underpins our shared culture. In much the same way, the Bible, beyond its specific words, serves as a cultural foundation. It is not merely a single book, but a library of texts that has shaped beliefs about something greater than ourselves. Even if one does not accept it as literal truth, its existence has long set the stage for how many nations, including America, have built their values and identities. Yet the Bible leaves many questions unanswered, particularly about Jesus. The Gospels emphasize his final week so extensively that nearly 30 years of his life remain shrouded in mystery. It is hard to grasp that the prophesied Son of God would remain inconspicuous for so long. This glaring gap, from a detailed infancy and early childhood to a sudden emergence at around age 30, raises questions about why the missing years are ignored. The Catholic doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity further complicates this picture by obscuring details about Jesus' familial relationships. Biblical references to Jesus' brothers, such as James the Just, Joseph, Simon, Judas, and at least 2 sisters, are muddled by cultural language that did not clearly distinguish between literal brothers and cousins. Mary, venerated as sinless and miraculous in some texts, is portrayed with a mysterious early life. Her birth marked by divine intervention, early temple upbringing, and later central to Mariology, despite early condemnations of such claims. The 4 canonical Gospels themselves provide conflicting views on Jesus' family. While Luke omits mention of his brothers entirely, Mark explicitly names them, referring to Jesus as both a carpenter and the son of Mary. Matthew modifies these details, reflecting cultural sensitivities that discouraged referring to a man solely as the son of his mother. Likewise, figures named James are confusing. James the Just, older and esteemed for his virtue, James the Less, and James, son of Zebedee, James the Great, one of the 12 apostles, are all mentioned, but their exact relationships remain ambiguous. Mary Magdalene, often mislabeled as a repentant prostitute, a claim with no gospel support, is another central yet enigmatic figure. All 4 Gospels highlight her importance. She was among the first to follow Jesus after he cast out demons, present at his crucifixion, and the first to witness and announce his resurrection, earning her the title Apostle to the Apostles. Non-canonical texts like the Gospel of Philip even hint at a closer, possibly financial, partnership between her and Jesus, suggesting she played a more significant role than traditionally acknowledged. The canonical narrative of Jesus' early life is equally puzzling. After a detailed account of his birth and infancy, there is little information from age 12 until his ministry begins around 30. During this long, undocumented period, he is portrayed as a typical Galilean youth learning carpentry, a depiction that some find at odds with the notion of a divine mission. Debates even persist about whether he was a carpenter himself or merely the son of one. Adding to the mystery are the 26 or so apocryphal Gospels and writings that were ultimately dismissed by the Orthodox Church. Some of these alternative texts propose radically different narratives. For example, one account claims that a young Jesus traveled to Britain. Built a small wattle chapel at Glastonbury with Joseph of Arimathea, and later had relics of the Last Supper enshrined there. Such legends illustrate how diverse early Christian lore could be. Legends, including the famous poem, "And did those feet in ancient time," illustrate how diverse and far-reaching early Christian lore could be, even if later dismissed as Jesus fan fiction by mainstream authorities. Some non-mainstream traditions, including passages from the Talmud, offer accounts where Jesus is portrayed not just as a religious figure, but as a political and military leader who married Mary Bathus and had a child named Sarah. Although these narratives are highly controversial, they further emphasize the fragmented and contested nature of Jesus' story. Most scholars today date Jesus' birth to around 4 BCE, with his ministry beginning around 27 CE and his death around 30 CE. Yet, despite these broadly accepted dates, the silence surrounding his early years continues to provoke questions about the reliability and completeness of the biblical record. This uncertainty challenges the traditional understanding of his life. In reflecting on these uncertainties, the author recalls a personal moment of honesty with his young daughter, explaining that Santa Claus is not the source of her gifts, while also acknowledging that he had not fully explained the deeper, more complex biblical Christmas story. Ultimately, the Bible stands as both a shared cultural reference and a text riddled with contradictions, omissions, and multiple interpretations. Its portrayal of Jesus' life, from a mysterious early existence to a public ministry full of ambiguity, invites ongoing exploration.
The New Testament is often presented as an unquestionable gospel, a fixed dogma that leaves no room for alternative interpretations. Ideas such as Jesus, Biblically knowing a woman, traveling beyond the Middle Eastern desert, or experiencing ordinary human emotions before his divine nature took hold are dismissed as blasphemous, even though many religions seem designed for the most dogmatic of believers. Jesus, like any human, experienced a typical first-century life that included childhood, suffering, and death. In the Apocryphon Gospel of Thomas, a second-century text, we see a portrayal of Jesus as a precocious yet rebellious child. He is depicted creating life from clay, cursing those who wrong him, and even blinding neighbors when confronted. In one story, a young Jesus revives a friend who has fallen from a roof, and in another, he corrects a mistake made by Joseph by magically extending a piece of wood to its proper length. These narratives, which emphasize both his supernatural capabilities and his youthful defiance, contrast sharply with the solitary mention of his teaching in the temple at age 12 in Luke, a gap that leaves many questions about his early life unanswered. The cinematic exploration of Jesus' humanity in films like Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ resonates with many because it portrays him not as a distant deity, but as a relatable man burdened by doubts, friendships, and imperfections. In this narrative, even Judas Iscariot, traditionally cast as the ultimate betrayer, plays a crucial, almost redemptive role. His internal torment and ambiguous loyalty highlight the complex human relationships underlying the biblical passion story. At the Last Supper, when Jesus passes the bread to Judas, it feels less like a fated betrayal and more like a heavy psychologically charged moment, underscoring the intimate bond between teacher and disciple that the canonical texts rarely explore. History, as we know it, is not a static record, but a malleable narrative shaped by those in power. Over time, the story of Jesus was refined and repurposed by priests and governments, eventually crystallizing into a doctrine that would dominate both religious belief and cultural identity. By around 300 CE, Christianity was institutionalized as the state religion, and with it came a surge in artistic, legal, and linguistic innovations that influenced the very fabric of Western civilization. The Bible not only unified a creed, but also helped codify the English language and culture through its liturgy, a transformation possible only because history is written by the literate and the powerful. The Pilgrims and Puritans, America's early religious settlers, embodied a fierce commitment to their version of divine truth. Fleeing the oppressive Church of England, they envisioned a new society built on strict, unyielding interpretations of Christianity. However, their quest for religious freedom soon devolved into a form of intolerance of its own. In their new world, dissent was often equated with heresy, and witch hunts became a grim manifestation of their zealotry. These early settlers, predominantly white and English, set the stage for an American culture deeply intertwined with both spiritual conviction and social exclusion. British colonial policy further complicated this picture. To populate the New World, British authorities relocated impoverished and marginalized populations, often derogatorily labeled as waste people or white trash. These groups, viewed as unproductive and inferior, nonetheless laid the physical and cultural foundations of what became known as the American dream. Over time, their descendants have been variously stigmatized, from colonial vagabonds to modern-day trailer park residents. Yet, they remain an integral part of the nation's story. The American Revolution did little to erase the class and racial prejudices inherited from England. While the new nation broke free from monarchical rule, its founders could not fully escape the entrenched ideas about social hierarchy. The ideals of self-reliance and upward mobility were in tension with a reality that favored those already in power. Influential groups like the Freemasons, who championed Enlightenment values such as individualism and limited government, helped shape a national ethos that celebrated freedom, yet often concealed deep social inequities. Their influence can still be traced in American symbols and institutions, from currency inscriptions to the design of Washington, D.C. Economic inequality, once rationalized as a natural outcome of a survival of the fittest society, has become a self-perpetuating feature of American life. Early political compromises, such as the establishment of the minimum wage in 1938, were tainted by racism and aimed at excluding Black and Latino workers from the benefits of a livable income. This legacy of exclusion is intertwined with the broader narrative of American prosperity, a prosperity built on the labor and sacrifice of the poor, who were once seen as the expendable underclass. In debates over modern American life, the symbolism of the gun has become a potent emblem of resistance against tyranny. Historically, individual arms ownership was essential for self-defense in a society wary of centralized power. The Second Amendment, like the Bill of Rights as a whole, was crafted in an era when personal weaponry was a safeguard against despotism. Today, however, the debate over gun rights often obscures the historical reality that the right to bear arms was intended to empower citizens in the face of governmental overreach. Despite periodic calls for disarmament, most recently in response to events like the January 6th Capitol riot, the legacy of armed self-defense remains a critical part of American identity, rooted in centuries of legal and cultural tradition. The narrative of American history is, in many ways, a story of contradictions. The same nation that was founded on principles of liberty and individual rights has repeatedly shown its willingness to enforce conformity and exclude those who do not fit its narrow definitions of worthiness. Whether it is the puritanical intolerance of dissent, the class-based discrimination against the impoverished, or the ongoing debates over gun control and governmental power, the struggle over who gets to participate in the American experiment continues to define the nation. Ultimately, the Bible and the stories of Jesus, whether in the canonical texts or the apocryphal writings, serve as powerful symbols of this struggle. They are at once sources of profound inspiration and instruments of ideological control. As memories shift and history is retold, the meaning of these narratives adapts to the needs of the present. The words of Confucius, "To know what you know and what you do not know, that is true knowledge," remind us that understanding our past requires a recognition of its complexities and contradictions. In our modern era, the challenge remains to decipher which parts of history are enduring truths and which are convenient myths, a task as difficult today as it was in the days of the earliest Christians. The debates over religion, class, and rights are not relics of a bygone era. They are the living, breathing conflicts that shape our society. The debates over religion, class, and rights are not relics of a bygone era. They are the living, breathing conflicts that shape our society. And in this light, whether through the lens of ancient gospels or modern constitutional debates, the struggle for a just society continues. A struggle that is, at its heart, about reclaiming the human story from the layers of imposed dogma and history.
President Biden opened our borders, a decision that has not only weakened our nation, but allowed a deadly flow of fentanyl into America, allegedly responsible for tens of thousands of deaths each year. With the Mexican drug cartels now wielding more power than the Mexican government, our southern neighbor has become destabilized. Yet, while the dangers grow, the political left remains strangely silent. A senior border official explained that the cartels have become sophisticated, transactional criminal organizations, charging every migrant attempting to cross the border. They continually change their methods, targeting families, children, and individuals alike. Reports indicate that even Chinese jumpers choosing the Mexican border can be charged up to $50,000. Young women, forced into degrading work to pay these fees, and the creation of rape trees as a means to taunt law enforcement further illustrate the dark underbelly of this crisis. The argument follows that this influx of immigrants could eventually shift U.S. demographics by nearly a 2% increase, potentially swinging future elections.
In Mexico, the cartel's brutal operations extend far beyond the border. Kidnapping is rampant, indigenous children are sold for rape in Guerrero, and immigrants from South America are coerced into drug production, only to be disposed of when they are no longer needed. Over 1,000 women are murdered each year in acts described as femicides, with some victims suffering grotesque violence. These stark realities are contrasted with the value of a $10 bill, a sum that, for many in Mexico, represents an entire day's hard, dangerous labor and the means for survival, whereas in America, it might buy a single drink at a bar. This economic disparity underlines a broader injustice: how those with means treat money and, by extension, the lives and dignity of those less fortunate. The debate over wealth and freedom spills into politics. Many wonder how it feels to see elected representatives taxing hard-earned income to support others, or even foreign interests, while individuals struggle to meet basic needs. Even renowned leftist Noam Chomsky has acknowledged that the left champions freedom, though both sides of the political spectrum ultimately claim this virtue. Our government, it seems, has caged us in a system where both major parties trade insults like wild dogs, using the promise of freedom as both bait and sustenance. There is no shared understanding of what freedom means, nor agreement on the fundamental roles of government. Democracy has been reduced to a mere ballot, while the American system appears irreparably broken. Yet amid this crisis, a pulse of resistance emerged, what some call a Great Awakening. The events of January 6, though widely condemned and labeled an insurrection, can also be seen as a modern-day Tea Party uprising. The day's chaos, manipulated by media and political elites, bears an uncanny resemblance to revolutionary acts of the past. Just as the signers of the Declaration of Independence committed acts of treason against their government, risking everything for a new future, the January 6th events were interpreted by some as a desperate cry against a system in decay. History remembers the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence as traitors who risked their lives and fortunes. Carter Braxton lost his wealth when his merchant fleet was destroyed. Thomas McKean and others faced persecution, the seizure of property, and personal losses. Their sacrifices were part of a collective statement that when government abuses become intolerable, people have not just a right, but a duty to rebel. How different would history view those same actions today? Yet modern narratives are fraught with contradictions. Some claim that the January 6th events were not an insurrection at all, despite overwhelming evidence of a deliberate uprising fueled by political discontent. High-profile figures, including prominent media personalities, have offered convoluted theories to explain the events, suggesting, for example, that former President Trump purposely set himself up to lose in order to discredit the election. The insurrection on January 6th was in many respects an act of patriotism, a desperate, if flawed, assertion of freedom reminiscent of Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, the Boston Tea Party, or the first shots fired at Lexington and Concord. A Capitol Police official, Stephen Sund, expressed his frustration at the failure to act decisively during the uprising, hinting at a possible deliberate delay that allowed the mob to grow. Video evidence, controversial detentions, and the seemingly orchestrated chaos inside the Capitol have only deepened suspicions that the insurrection was more than a spontaneous outbreak of anger. Our nation's founders wrote the Constitution and Declaration not as symbols of passive freedom, but as a blueprint for rebellion against tyranny. As Calvin Coolidge once said, "It is the government's role to protect the weak, but only by upholding the law. When government actions stray into the realm of tyranny, disobedience becomes not just a right, but a necessity." The events of January 6th, though failing to achieve their broader political aims, underscored a deep-seated national discontent with a government that many feel has lost its legitimacy. Critics argue that the storming of the Capitol was a deliberate act of insurrection, a targeted strike against the established order. They point out that while riots at places like Walmart might be dismissed as senseless violence, the actions taken in Washington were aimed at overthrowing a system seen as fundamentally corrupt. The ensuing investigations, media spin, and public outcry have done little to address the systemic issues that gave rise to such extreme measures. In the broader historical context, America has weathered numerous crises, from racial riots following the death of Martin Luther King Jr. to multiple assassination attempts on its presidents. Violence has been an inextricable part of the American political process. Yet each time, the nation has somehow managed to rebuild. Today, however, many fear that the pillars of our democracy are eroding. The debates over illegal immigration, political dissent, and the very definition of freedom are more than just partisan squabbles. They are existential questions about the future of the republic. Some argue that the failures of modern democracy signal the inevitable need for further insurrection. They point to the unresolved tensions from the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and MLK, and the persistent struggles over civil rights and economic inequality. In this view, the upheavals of the past were not isolated incidents, but part of a continuum, a series of radical shifts that eventually forced America to redefine itself. Yet, while violence and rebellion may have catalyzed change in the past, the risks today are magnified by a complex, interconnected global society where the consequences of insurrection could be far more dire. The legacy of figures like Martin Luther King Jr. is similarly contested. Once seen as a radical anti-capitalist fighting for true freedom, King has been recast by many as a benign, almost mythic figure. Critics argue that this whitewashing of his legacy serves to dilute his original message of resistance against systemic oppression. They contend that the transformation of King into a mere symbol of peaceful protest reflects a broader tendency to sanitize and control the narrative of American dissent. Some even suggest that the current educational and cultural emphasis on a single, unchallenged version of history does a disservice to the complexities of the past. In this light, modern depictions of heroes and martyrs become not just historical accounts, but political tools, used to shape public opinion and justify the status quo. The deification of figures like MLK, along with the vilification of any dissent that deviates from the accepted narrative, stifles the kind of raw, unfiltered patriotism that once fueled America's most revolutionary moments. Critics charge that institutions like the media and academia now serve to uphold a distorted view of freedom, one that leaves little room for genuine, even if messy, expressions of dissent. As the nation grapples with its future, these questions become ever more urgent. What does it mean to be free in a country where dissent is increasingly demonized? When the government appears to serve only itself, is rebellion not a natural and perhaps necessary response? And if insurrection in some form is inevitable, what will be its cost? The reality is that our political system is at a crossroads. On one side, we see an entrenched establishment that many believe is bleeding the nation dry through endless taxation and bureaucratic overreach. On the other, a rising tide of discontent that, while fraught with chaos and violence, signals a desperate call for change. The events of January 6th, controversial as they are, underscore a broader crisis, a loss of trust in the institutions that are supposed to serve the people. For many, the memory of that day, like the echoes of the American Revolution, is a reminder that true freedom has always come at a steep price. It is a call to confront the abuses of power head-on, even if that means challenging the very foundations of government. As history has shown, the struggle for freedom is never easy, but it remains the defining characteristic of any truly democratic society. In the end, the debate over borders, insurrection, and the legacy of American dissent is not merely academic. It is a visceral struggle over who we are as a nation and what we are willing to endure in the name of liberty. If we are to learn from our past and avoid the fate of a nation that has lost its soul, we must be willing to confront the uncomfortable truths about power, injustice, and the price of freedom.